The night air in Brentwood carried a chilling silence, one that no neighbor could explain. On December 14th, 2025, what should have been another quiet Sunday evening turned into a nightmare the Reiner family and the city of Los Angeles would never forget. When Romy Reiner, 27, returned home, she was met with a scene that would haunt her forever. The lifeless bodies of her parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner, stabbed to death in their own $13.5 million estate. The horror of that moment is hard to fathom. Yet what happened afterward? The investigation, the FBI's discoveries, and the shocking truth behind the walls of a seemingly perfect home would change everything we thought we knew about this family. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine, for a moment, walking into your childhood home, expecting normalcy, laughter, maybe even the faint scent of dinner still lingering. Instead, you find tragedy. Every detail matters: the position of a body, the angle of a weapon, the faintest trace of evidence that whispers secrets about the last moments of life. Romy's discovery was not just tragic. It was the opening chapter of a story filled with secrets, betrayal, and a mystery that no one saw coming. And in the center of it all was Nick Reiner, the 32-year-old son who lived just steps away in the guest house. Within hours, he was arrested, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, and suddenly, every piece of the family's life was under scrutiny. But why would someone allegedly do this to their own parents? Was it premeditated? Was it a moment of uncontrollable rage? Or was there something deeper, more hidden, that only a careful investigation could uncover? These questions would not only drive the media frenzy, but also keep investigators, neighbors, and the public on edge. And perhaps the most terrifying element was this: the FBI, called to assist, would uncover details in Nick Reiner's bedroom that no one could have anticipated. Details that would make the tragedy even more confounding and, frankly, chilling. The first reports painted a grim picture. Authorities confirmed the cause of death as multiple sharp force injuries and officially labeled the manner of death as homicide. Yet, even with these official statements, questions abounded. Who had motive? Who had opportunity? And most crucially, what did Nick Reiner know, and what was he hiding? Romy's tip to police, labeling a dangerous family member as a suspect, suggested that she already feared the possibility of violence, though she could never have predicted the events of that day. From the outside, the Reiner family seemed emblematic of Los Angeles' success. Rob Reiner, known worldwide for his career and cultural influence, lived a life that many would envy. Michelle Reiner, at 70, maintained the dignity, grace, and social presence expected of someone in their position. Their estate in Brentwood was a symbol of achievement, sprawling, meticulously maintained, and, at least on the surface, a haven for family gatherings, celebrations, and private moments. Yet beneath the manicured lawns and artfully decorated interiors, tensions festered, shadows grew, and the stage was set for a tragedy that would ripple across the city and beyond. Nick Reiner's life in the guest house seemed isolated, almost insular. Living just steps away from his parents' grand mansion, he occupied a world of his own. To outsiders, he appeared private, perhaps even reserved. But as investigators would soon discover, privacy does not always equal innocence, and the secrets within that guest house, and especially within Nick's bedroom, would become central to understanding this horrific event. The night of the murders, the Brentwood neighborhood was as unsuspecting as ever. Streetlights flickered over quiet roads, and neighbors, perhaps unknowingly, passed by moments that would later be dissected in court and the media. Romy's immediate reaction, alerting authorities, pointing to the dangerous family member, set in motion a chain of events that led to the FBI's involvement. Here is where the story takes a turn from tragedy into a labyrinth of psychological intrigue. The FBI does not involve itself in every domestic homicide. Their presence usually indicates complexity, something beyond the straightforward application of law. And when they entered Nick Reiner's bedroom, their findings suggested that what occurred in that estate was not only shocking, but also deeply disturbing in ways that mere reporting could scarcely capture. As the investigation unfolded, questions arose not only about motive but about the nature of the evidence itself. How do you interpret a room that could hold the answers to such a crime? The FBI's methodical approach, their examination of digital footprints, physical evidence, and even seemingly mundane personal items, would reveal patterns of behavior, hidden tensions, and perhaps signs of premeditation. Every object, every note, every misplaced item had the potential to tell a story that contradicted the surface-level narrative. And it was in that delicate, intensely scrutinized space, the bedroom, that investigators would uncover the details that would make this case unforgettable. What makes this story different from other high-profile family tragedies is the interplay between wealth, secrecy, and the unexpected depth of human psychology. In affluent families, the world often sees the curated exterior, success, sophistication, and normalcy. But as this case would reveal, the inside, the private sphere of bedrooms, hidden documents, and digital histories, can conceal truths that are both shocking and profoundly human. What investigators found in Nick Reiner's bedroom was not merely evidence. It was a narrative, a window into a mindset, and a puzzle piece that could finally start to answer the haunting question, why? By now, you might be wondering about the timeline, the discovery, and the immediate reactions of law enforcement. Each element of the case has its own weight. The precise time of death, the initial police reports, and the rapid arrest of Nick Reiner. Yet even with these details, the story refuses to simplify itself. The tragedy is compounded by the intimate family dynamics, the hidden tensions, and the potential warning signs that were noticed too late. This is not just a story of crime. It is a story of human complexity, of secrets kept, and of the devastating consequences when those secrets erupt into violence. And here's the chilling truth. What was found inside Nick Reiner's bedroom would not only shock investigators, it would challenge every assumption about motive, method, and the reality of what occurred that night. It was evidence that promised to answer questions but simultaneously raised new ones, leaving investigators, family members, and the public grappling with disbelief, anger, and sorrow. So, where do we go from here? How do we start to unpack the layers of this tragedy, piece together the timeline, and understand the human story behind the headlines? The journey begins with the crime scene itself, moves into Nick Reiner's life and mindset, and escalates through the shocking discoveries made by the FBI. Every detail matters, every twist heightens the stakes, and every revelation teases something even darker lurking beneath the surface. The first thing investigators noticed when they arrived at the Reiner estate was how ordinary it all seemed. On the outside, the Brentwood mansion was the picture of luxury, a sprawling property with manicured lawns, high hedges offering privacy, and the kind of understated elegance that screamed old money. Nothing about the exterior hinted at the horror waiting inside. But appearances, as often they do, were deceiving. Romy Reiner was the first to discover her parents' bodies. She told police that she had returned to the estate that Sunday afternoon to check on her parents, something she often did when Nick was at home in the guest house. She had apparently sensed something off, an intuition that would prove tragically accurate. As she stepped into the main house, the scene she encountered was beyond anything she could have imagined. Her mother and father were gone, lifeless, stabbed multiple times. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, mingling with the faint perfume of the house's usual ambience, a chilling contrast that made the scene even more surreal. Police officers who first arrived described the interior as eerily quiet. Every detail was meticulously noted: the angle of the bodies, the placement of the weapons, the absence of struggle in certain areas. These early observations would later form the backbone of the investigation. Forensic teams immediately began cataloging evidence, photographing the scene, and noting anything unusual. Even at this stage, certain anomalies stood out, things that suggested this was no ordinary act of domestic violence, no impulsive crime of passion. The FBI was called in quickly. Their involvement indicated that there were complexities beyond what typical homicide investigations usually present. While the LAPD was fully capable of handling domestic homicides, the FBI's presence suggested a need for federal-level scrutiny, whether because of the family's profile, potential premeditation, or evidence that might have crossed jurisdictions digitally or financially. Their arrival marked a turning point in the investigation. The case was no longer just a local tragedy. It was becoming a story that would captivate national attention. Inside the mansion, investigators began piecing together the timeline. According to preliminary reports, the murders had occurred earlier that day, or possibly the night before, but the exact window of time was difficult to determine immediately. Every detail mattered. The position of the bodies suggested that the victims had been caught off guard, while other evidence hinted at some struggle. Investigators had to determine whether this was a targeted act by someone close to the family or a more random intrusion. But the early evidence, combined with Romy's statements, quickly narrowed the suspect pool. Romy's account was particularly striking. She mentioned a dangerous family member, without naming names initially, who should be considered a suspect. This warning was a critical lead. It suggested foreknowledge, a pre-existing awareness of tension or potential for violence, and it positioned the investigators to focus on someone already within the household's orbit. It also raised questions about the dynamics of the Reiner family. Had there been warnings ignored, signals missed, or signs of escalating conflict? The physical layout of the estate also played a role in the investigation. Nick lived in a guest house on the property, which, while separate, was close enough for him to be aware of his parents' movements. Investigators considered multiple scenarios. Could he have committed the act alone? Did he plan it? Was there any indication of coercion or assistance from someone else? Every angle had to be meticulously considered. Early media reports added another layer of pressure. News outlets began speculating about motive, mental health, financial disputes, and family history. The public reaction was immediate. Disbelief, horror, and fascination all mingled in equal measure. But while speculation ran rampant, law enforcement remained focused on the physical evidence. The scene itself was telling. Investigators noted that the weapons used were consistent with multiple sharp force injuries, a detail that suggested close, personal violence rather than a distant attack. This implied an intimate knowledge of the victims, reinforcing the focus on someone within the family or household. Other aspects of the crime scene hinted at premeditation. Certain items were out of place, doors had been locked or unlocked in unusual patterns, and traces of digital activity suggested surveillance or monitoring before the act. Neighbors reported little, but their statements were scrutinized nonetheless. One neighbor mentioned seeing lights in the guest house late at night, while another recalled hearing what could have been an argument. These seemingly minor observations helped build a broader picture of the day's events, contributing to a timeline that investigators would refine over the coming weeks. As the FBI focused on Nick's guest house and, more specifically, his bedroom, the story began to take a darker turn. The bedroom, a personal space most would consider private, revealed traces of tension, secrecy, and perhaps even intent. While the mansion bore the physical evidence of the crime, the guest house contained psychological evidence, a trail of digital activity, notes, personal items, and other indicators that painted a picture of Nick's state of mind leading up to the tragedy. The juxtaposition of the two locations, the mansion as the site of death and the guest house as the site of hidden truths, highlighted the complexity of the investigation. Law enforcement wasn't just trying to determine how the murders happened, they were trying to understand why, using every possible clue from both physical and psychological evidence. And then there were the contradictions. Early reports suggested moments of confusion. Timelines didn't match, witness statements conflicted, and digital evidence was ambiguous. Investigators realized that solving this case would require untangling layers of misinformation, misdirection, and deeply personal motives. It wasn't just a matter of connecting dots. It was about understanding the story those dots told. Perhaps most chilling of all was the realization that the scene inside the mansion and the evidence in the guest house hinted at something premeditated, something that could only have come from someone intimately familiar with the family's routines, habits, and vulnerabilities. The investigators knew they were dealing with more than a crime of opportunity. They were dealing with a calculated act that demanded answers at multiple levels: psychological, financial, and emotional. By the time the FBI finished their initial walkthrough, one thing was clear: this case would not follow a typical trajectory. Each piece of evidence, from the positions of the bodies to the smallest items in Nick's bedroom, was a puzzle piece in a narrative that investigators were only beginning to understand. Every discovery pointed to a deeper, more unsettling truth about family, secrecy, and the potential for violence even in the most seemingly secure homes. And yet, even with the mansion meticulously catalogued, the guest house unexplored, and Romy's testimony recorded, the most shocking discoveries were still ahead. The items, the notes, the digital traces inside Nick Reiner's bedroom, the place he called private, would force investigators to question everything. Motive, method, and premeditation were about to collide in a way no one could have predicted. Who exactly was Nick Reiner, the 32-year-old son living quietly in the guest house just steps away from his parents' mansion? To outsiders, Nick seemed unremarkable at first glance, private, perhaps reserved, living a life that didn't attract attention. But in a tragedy like this, the ordinary can often mask the extraordinary, and the truth about Nick would begin to emerge in ways that shocked even those who knew him best. Nick's upbringing was steeped in privilege. Growing up in a high-profile household, he experienced a life many only dream of: access to resources, elite schools, and a family name recognized across industries. Yet wealth and fame do not shield one from psychological tension, and investigators would later uncover a series of subtle, often overlooked, indicators of strain, resentment, and secrecy. To understand the events of December 14th, it was crucial to examine the environment in which Nick grew up, and the family dynamics that defined his relationships with his parents and siblings. Reports suggest that Nick's relationship with his parents, while publicly polite, had private tensions. These tensions were not unusual in wealthy families, but in hindsight, they painted a portrait of a household in which emotional undercurrents could escalate without warning. Friends and neighbors described Nick as intelligent, observant, and somewhat introverted. He wasn't prone to outbursts in public, yet some accounts hinted at periods of withdrawal or unexplained anger in private. Was this simply the behavior of a young man navigating expectations, or was it something more concerning? Living in the guest house, Nick maintained a separate world. The space was functional, private, and, as the FBI would later discover, a repository of his personal life that held key insights into his state of mind. While he shared property with his parents, his guest house lifestyle allowed a degree of separation, freedom, yes, but also isolation. In forensic psychology, isolation can be a double-edged sword. It can provide comfort and safety, or it can foster resentment, obsessive thoughts, and even dangerous planning. Every detail from the guest house would later become critical to understanding the events that unfolded. Some reports suggested financial tension, though these remained speculative. Nick's access to family wealth and resources may have been a point of friction, not in terms of survival, but in terms of control and independence. How much freedom did he actually have, and how much autonomy did he crave? Investigators would eventually explore whether financial grievances played any role in motive, or whether the true catalysts were far more psychological and emotional. Nick's social interactions were also scrutinized. Friends described him as courteous but sometimes distant, the kind of person who kept thoughts and feelings to himself. In isolation, private thoughts can become magnified, feeding narratives that may or may not reflect reality. It's a dynamic that psychologists have studied in numerous cases. The quiet individual living near loved ones can become hyper-focused on perceived slights or injustices, whether real or imagined. Investigators were careful to document these tendencies, as they could shed light on Nick's mindset leading up to the murders. The media, of course, had its own narrative. Headlines portrayed Nick as the quiet son, the one living in the shadows of his parents' public lives. Some coverage speculated about mental health, others about family disputes, while certain outlets leaned into sensationalized portrayals. Yet the truth, as law enforcement would uncover, was more complex and far more chilling than any article could capture. The discrepancy between Nick's public persona and his private actions would become a focal point for understanding not just the crime, but the psychology behind it. When investigators examined Nick's guest house, they noted subtle but telling details. The room appeared orderly at first glance, but under scrutiny, patterns emerged. Digital activity logged at unusual hours, personal notes that suggested obsessive thought patterns, and objects that hinted at preparation for something significant. These discoveries suggested a mind preoccupied with secrecy, control, and perhaps anticipation of confrontation. In short, Nick's world, though seemingly normal, was layered with tension, secrecy, and complexity. But what about his interactions with his parents? Romy's statements indicated that Nick had been on her radar as dangerous, though she may not have fully understood the extent of the threat. Investigators would later reconstruct phone logs, social media interactions, and in-person behavior to determine the dynamics of his relationship with Rob and Michelle. These details provided insight into conflicts, both overt and subtle. Nick's life in Brentwood, however, was not entirely devoid of outside contact. Neighbors recalled seeing him run errands, occasionally interact with staff, and maintain the guest house grounds. He didn't isolate himself completely, but for investigators, the key was not his public behavior. It was the private realm of the guest house and, most importantly, his bedroom. Within that space, Nick's personality, fears, intentions, and perhaps even his planning for the events of December 14th were all quietly chronicled in ways that only forensic experts could interpret. The question remained, was Nick a victim of circumstance or an architect of a planned act? The evidence from his personal space would begin to answer this, revealing a pattern of behavior that contradicted his outwardly calm demeanor. Notes, digital traces, and objects found during the FBI's search suggested contemplation and deliberation rather than impulsive rage. Each item told a fragment of a story investigators would have to piece together with precision, patience, and psychological insight. Friends and acquaintances also contributed to the picture. Some noted moments of tension or withdrawn behavior, while others highlighted seemingly mundane habits that, under scrutiny, suggested deeper thought processes and patterns. Law enforcement meticulously documented every detail, recognizing that in cases like this, minor observations often become pivotal. By the end of their investigation into Nick's background and personality, investigators were beginning to see a complex portrait. A man who outwardly appeared quiet and unremarkable, yet whose private world hinted at deeper conflict, secrecy, and premeditation. The convergence of his proximity to the victims, his psychological profile, and the evidence within his guest house made him the central figure in understanding the murders. And yet, even with these insights, one element remained elusive. What exactly was hidden inside Nick's bedroom? The FBI had begun cataloging items, tracing digital footprints, and examining notes that suggested a mind at work behind closed doors. These discoveries would not only provide clarity about the events leading up to the tragedy, but also raise new, unsettling questions. Could a person so close to the family really have planned such a violent act? What patterns of thought and behavior had led to this moment? And what, ultimately, would the evidence reveal about Nick's intentions and mindset? As the investigators prepared to enter the bedroom that would reveal the first major clues, tension was palpable. Every object, every note, every trace of activity was a potential key to unlocking the mystery. And within that room, the story of December 14th was beginning to take shape in a way that would shock even the most seasoned professionals. The moment the FBI stepped onto the Reiner estate, the dynamic of the investigation shifted. What had begun as a standard homicide case now carried the weight of federal scrutiny. Their involvement signaled that the evidence, or the circumstances, were anything but ordinary. Experienced agents approached the scene with methodical precision, aware that every detail could unravel or reinforce a narrative that had captivated the public and horrified the family. From the outset, the FBI's role was clear: document, preserve, and analyze evidence in a way that left no room for error. Unlike local police, who handle hundreds of domestic disputes annually, the FBI brought resources and forensic expertise capable of uncovering hidden patterns in behavior, digital footprints, and physical evidence. Their arrival also underscored the seriousness of the crime. This wasn't just a tragic incident. It was a puzzle requiring a level of scrutiny that few cases demand. The agent's first priority was the scene itself, the mansion where Rob and Michelle Reiner had been murdered. Every corner was examined, every item cataloged, every surface photographed. The FBI treated the space like a story waiting to be read, knowing that physical evidence could provide insights into motive, timeline, and method. Blood spatter patterns, the position of the bodies, the angles of the wounds. Each offered clues that could confirm or contradict statements from witnesses and family members. But as meticulous as the agents were in the mansion, their attention soon turned to the guest house, and more specifically, to Nick Reiner's bedroom. This was the epicenter of the investigation. While the mansion told the story of the crime itself, the bedroom promised answers to the why and how. Every item in the room, from personal notes to digital devices, could reveal psychological patterns and, potentially, premeditation. Agents approached the room with caution. They understood that they were about to enter a space saturated with personal history and secrets that no one else had fully glimpsed. Initial observations were subtle but telling. The bedroom was orderly at first glance, yet the FBI's forensic team noted patterns inconsistent with casual tidiness. Certain items were strategically placed, while others were hidden or secured. Digital devices, computers, tablets, phones showed unusual activity. Timestamps, deleted files, encrypted folders. It was clear that someone had been careful about controlling what could be observed, and investigators knew that understanding this control was key to understanding the mind behind it. The agents also paid close attention to personal artifacts, notes, journals, photographs. Each object had the potential to provide insight into Nick's thoughts, fears, and intentions. Investigators documented everything, knowing that even the smallest detail, an underlined word, a bookmarked page, or a cryptic note, could later prove critical in reconstructing the sequence of events. In cases like this, ordinary items can reveal extraordinary truths. At the same time, the FBI analyzed the layout of the property and the relationship between the mansion and guest house. Surveillance possibilities, lines of sight, and potential escape routes were all considered. Every angle was scrutinized to determine how someone could move between spaces, whether anyone could have witnessed events, and how premeditation might have played a role. The team knew that understanding the geography of the estate was as important as cataloging the physical evidence itself. Digital forensics became a central focus. Investigators combed through devices for emails, texts, social media interactions, and search histories. Each entry was examined for tone, timing, and relevance. Even the most mundane search could reveal preoccupation, obsession, or planning. They looked for anomalies, patterns, and contradictions, anything that suggested motive, intent, or concealment. Early findings hinted at activity that was deliberately structured, raising questions about whether the events of December 14th were impulsive or carefully orchestrated. As evidence was cataloged, the FBI worked in tandem with the LAPD to construct a timeline. Every interaction, movement, and communication was logged. They sought to determine when Rob and Michelle Reiner were attacked, whether there were signs of struggle, and how long Nick Reiner had been in the guest house before or after the murders. This painstaking process would eventually reveal gaps, inconsistencies, and subtle indicators that only trained eyes could detect. Agents also considered psychological factors. Profiles were created, and behavioral analysis was integrated into the investigation. The FBI's behavioral scientists sought to understand Nick's mindset leading up to the incident. What were his motivations? How did he perceive his parents and siblings? Was there evidence of planning, resentment, or emotional detachment? These questions guided the interpretation of physical and digital evidence, connecting tangible clues to the intangible workings of the mind. Interviews were conducted meticulously. Romy's statements were reviewed in detail, as were accounts from friends, neighbors, and staff. The goal was to corroborate evidence found at the scene with witness testimony. Discrepancies were noted and further investigated. The FBI's attention to these inconsistencies reflected their understanding that truth often hides between what people say and what the evidence proves. Then there were the contradictions. Some preliminary findings suggested impulsivity, others suggested forethought. Investigators had to reconcile conflicting data points, a process that required careful analysis of timing, spatial arrangement, and behavioral indicators. These contradictions, rather than slowing the investigation, heightened the sense of urgency. They suggested complexity, depth, and a level of planning that might not have been immediately apparent. The bedroom itself began to tell a story. Investigators discovered objects and notes that hinted at obsessive thought patterns and an unusual attention to detail. Certain items, seemingly innocuous, raised questions about premeditation, lists, journals, or items placed in ways that suggested monitoring or preparation. These discoveries would become pivotal as they provided insight not just into what had happened, but why. The psychological footprint of the suspect was becoming tangible, and the implications were profound. By the end of their initial analysis, the FBI had constructed a preliminary profile, a suspect with proximity, opportunity, and motive that extended beyond simple familial discord. They understood that the case was not only a matter of violent crime, but also a psychological puzzle, requiring synthesis of evidence from multiple domains: physical, digital, and behavioral. Yet, even with these insights, the most critical discoveries were still to come. The bedroom, the guest house, and the estate as a whole held secrets that had not yet been uncovered. Agents knew that as they delved deeper, each layer peeled back would reveal more than just evidence. It would reveal the story behind the tragedy, the mindset of the person at its center, and the chain of events that led to a family's unimaginable loss. When the FBI finally entered Nick Reiner's bedroom, it was clear that this was not just a room. It was a window into the mind of someone who lived under the same roof as tragedy, yet in a space of careful separation. At first glance, the room appeared ordinary: a bed neatly made, shelves lined with books, a desk with a laptop. But experienced investigators know that ordinary appearances can be deceiving, and within minutes, the bedroom began to reveal secrets that no outsider could have anticipated. The first thing the agents noticed was the meticulous organization. Every item seemed deliberately placed, every surface curated. But unlike a typical tidy room, there were subtle irregularities. Some drawers were locked, some shelves held objects not in plain view, and certain items were positioned in ways that suggested they had been deliberately staged, or perhaps hidden from curious eyes. This was not the chaotic space of someone living a carefree life. It was the space of someone cautious, deliberate, and aware of scrutiny. On the desk, investigators found digital devices: laptops, tablets, phones. Each had been wiped clean in some areas, yet traces remained. Encrypted folders, deleted messages, and unusual browsing histories hinted at activity that went beyond normal personal use. There were files with cryptic titles, notes saved digitally, and email exchanges that seemed mundane at first glance but, when pieced together, painted a pattern of obsession and control. This digital trail suggested premeditation. Thoughtful, calculated, and carefully executed. Physical notes and journals added another layer. Some were written in neat handwriting. Others were scribbled in haste, perhaps in moments of heightened emotion. The content ranged from mundane reflections to detailed observations of family routines. Certain entries suggested monitoring: who was home at what time, patterns of movement, even minor habits that, in isolation, might seem trivial. Yet when viewed together, these entries revealed a mind focused intently on the household and, more specifically, on the daily lives of his parents. Investigators also found objects that hinted at psychological tension. Books on behavior, control, and influence were stacked alongside seemingly innocuous personal items. Some objects appeared to have been deliberately placed for easy access. Others seemed hidden, their presence almost a secret within the secretive space of the room. These findings suggested a duality: a public self versus a private self, each inhabiting the same space but operating under different rules. Perhaps most intriguing were small details that could easily be overlooked: photographs marked with notations, receipts for items purchased, and personal effects arranged in patterns that suggested thoughtfulness beyond normal habit. Forensic teams noted the placement of these objects, recognizing that their arrangement might reveal intention, mindset, or even planning related to the murders. Every detail mattered, no matter how minor it appeared. The FBI's forensic experts also examined traces of communication. Deleted messages were partially recovered, revealing conversations that hinted at conflict, tension, or preoccupation with family dynamics. Some messages were ambiguous, others more direct. But collectively, they suggested that Nick had been mentally engaged with his parents' lives in a way that went beyond ordinary concern. Behavioral analysts noted that this focus, when combined with secrecy and isolation, could be indicative of a mind preparing for significant action. Agents also considered the spatial layout of the room itself. The placement of the bed, the desk, and personal items suggested awareness of movement and surveillance. Was someone anticipating observation? Were certain areas deliberately left visible or hidden to control what others might see? These questions, though subtle, became central to understanding the psychological environment that had formed around Nick. Even mundane items provided clues. Clothing folded with precision, personal effects stored in specific patterns, and objects moved to different locations over time all suggested a level of thought and intention that investigators could not ignore. To the trained eye, these were not merely signs of neatness. They were behavioral indicators, footprints of thought, and evidence of someone who was meticulous, deliberate, and perhaps even calculating. Digital activity provided additional layers. Search histories included queries about family disputes, legal ramifications, and psychological behavior. Certain files appeared to have been created as early as months prior, indicating a long-term engagement with topics that could relate to motive or planning. Investigators began to piece together a narrative that combined physical evidence, digital footprints, and behavioral indicators into a portrait of a person whose private world was at once controlled, secretive, and increasingly disturbing. Perhaps the most unsettling discovery was the interplay between mundane and cryptic elements. A seemingly ordinary journal might sit next to a digital file with a threatening title. A receipt for a simple household item could be next to a note outlining schedules and patterns. The room itself became a narrative device. Every object, placement, and digital artifact contributed to a story of preoccupation, secrecy, and careful observation. Behavioral analysts emphasized the significance of these findings. In cases like this, where the suspect lives in close proximity to the victims, the private space can reveal motivations, premeditation, and intent more clearly than interviews or witness statements alone. Every pattern, every detail, every anomaly in Nick's bedroom was a clue, a fragment of a larger psychological puzzle that investigators would spend weeks attempting to decode. And yet, despite the wealth of information uncovered in the room, questions remained. Why had certain items been deliberately hidden? What was the significance of the notes and digital files? And perhaps most importantly, how did the evidence in the bedroom connect to the violent acts that took place in the mansion? These questions would drive the next phase of the investigation, guiding both the forensic analysis and the psychological profiling that would become central to the case. The FBI's examination of the room also revealed contradictions. While some items suggested meticulous planning, others hinted at impulsivity or unpredictability. This duality complicated the narrative, suggesting that the suspect's mindset was not linear but layered, combining careful thought with emotional volatility. Investigators recognized that understanding these contradictions would be key to reconstructing the events leading up to December 14th. By the time the initial search concluded, one thing was clear: the bedroom was not just a room. It was a map of thought, emotion, and intention. Every object, note, and device told a story, one that investigators would continue to unravel in the coming days and weeks. It was a story that spoke to secrecy, obsession, and an unnerving level of preoccupation with the victims' lives. And yet, as compelling as the findings were, the most critical discoveries were still ahead. Certain items, overlooked at first glance, would later emerge as pivotal evidence. Clues that would reshape the investigation, challenge assumptions about motive, and ultimately force law enforcement and the public to confront a truth far more unsettling than anyone could have imagined. Sometimes, the most shocking truths aren't in plain sight. They're hidden in whispers, subtle behaviors, and long-forgotten conversations. In the case of the Reiners, what initially appeared to be a high-profile, tragic murder quickly evolved into a labyrinth of family secrets, long-standing resentments, and unexpected revelations. By the time investigators and the FBI began piecing together the household's private history, it became clear that the tragedy was rooted not only in a single violent act, but in patterns of behavior and hidden dynamics that had persisted for years. Romy's tip to the police, that a dangerous family member should be a suspect, was only the beginning. Her statement suggested an awareness of tension within the family, but investigators needed context. Why had Romy felt compelled to warn authorities? What incidents, arguments, or signs had led her to sense imminent danger? In interviews with family friends, former staff, and neighbors, a complex picture emerged. There were repeated accounts of Nick being withdrawn, sensitive to criticism, and at times unusually obsessive about the family's routines. These behaviors, when combined with the evidence found in his bedroom, hinted at psychological preoccupation that went far beyond normal familial concern. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered long-standing family conflicts that had rarely surfaced publicly. Some were financial in nature. Questions over inheritance, control of assets, or autonomy within the household. Others were emotional, revolving around perceived favoritism, disagreements over decisions, or unresolved childhood grievances. While these disputes may have seemed minor in isolation, within the context of a high-pressure, high-profile family, they formed a backdrop of tension that could escalate in unpredictable ways. Neighbors and friends described a family outwardly composed, yet privately fraught with subtle disputes. The Reiners were meticulous about appearances, maintaining a public image of success, elegance, and cohesion. Yet private accounts suggested that beneath this facade, disagreements simmered. For example, some staff members noted that Nick would often become agitated over seemingly trivial matters. Objects moved without his knowledge, schedules disrupted, or social plans altered without his input. While these instances might appear innocuous, investigators recognized them as potential indicators of underlying psychological stress or growing resentment. The FBI's forensic review added nuance to these observations. Notes and journals recovered from Nick's bedroom revealed obsessive attention to detail regarding his parents' schedules, movements, and habits. Some entries described tensions, arguments, or perceived slights in language that combined emotional intensity with analytical observation. Investigators interpreted this as more than simple documentation. It suggested a mind focused on control, monitoring, and perhaps premeditation. Every detail captured in these notes could reveal intentions, anxieties, or even planning that would later be corroborated by physical evidence. One particularly chilling discovery involved accounts of early warnings from Romy and other family members. In several private conversations, Romy allegedly expressed concern about Nick's behavior, describing him as unpredictable or dangerous in certain contexts. These conversations, once pieced together with digital communication records, indicated that Nick may have been aware of scrutiny and perhaps even anticipated conflict. The combination of pre-existing tension and careful observation of family dynamics raised critical questions. Had anyone truly understood the risk he posed, or had warning signs gone unnoticed until it was too late? Investigators also uncovered subtle financial dynamics that may have played a role. While the Reiner estate was significant, control over certain accounts, assets, or decisions appeared to have been a source of contention. Nick's access to resources was reportedly limited in ways that may have frustrated him, according to witness accounts. While financial motive alone cannot explain violent acts, in combination with psychological tension, obsessive monitoring, and familial resentment, it added a layer of potential pressure that could illuminate motive. The interplay between family secrecy and public image was particularly striking. Publicly, the Reiners were the epitome of cohesion. Elegant, composed, and admired. Privately, their home was a theater of tension, emotional complexity, and unspoken grievances. The contrast between exterior and interior life, between appearances and reality, became a recurring theme in the investigation. Every item recovered, every digital trace found, and every statement taken provided a window into this hidden world. For the FBI, the challenge was to integrate these family secrets into the broader investigation. It wasn't enough to examine physical evidence or digital footprints alone. Understanding the psychological and emotional backdrop, the hidden resentments, obsessions, and familial dynamics, was essential to reconstructing what had occurred. Agents analyzed patterns, who interacted with whom, which conflicts escalated, and which behaviors suggested premeditation versus reactive anger. One of the most surprising revelations involved correspondence that suggested prior disputes may have extended beyond simple disagreements. Certain emails and messages hinted at threats, whether explicit or implied, while other entries in Nick's journals suggested contemplation of extreme actions. These findings complicated the narrative. If there had been warning signs, how had they gone unaddressed, and why had intervention failed? Investigators realized they were confronting a layered story, one in which private family struggles intersected tragically with violent action. Another critical discovery was the subtle but telling evidence of control. Nick's meticulous observations, combined with items placed deliberately within the bedroom, suggested an ongoing preoccupation with influence over the household. Behavioral analysts noted patterns consistent with obsessive monitoring, tracking movements, cataloging routines, and focusing intensely on perceived slights or injustices. These behaviors were not necessarily criminal on their own, but in the context of the murders, they painted a picture of escalating fixation that may have culminated in violence. As family secrets began to surface, the broader narrative took shape. The Reiners were not merely victims of a random act. They were entangled in a network of hidden dynamics, tensions, and psychological pressures that had been simmering for years. Each secret uncovered, whether related to money, personal grievances, or behavioral anomalies, became a key piece of the puzzle. It was a stark reminder that even in families that appear flawless from the outside, private conflicts can grow unchecked, sometimes with devastating consequences. The combination of evidence from the bedroom, digital records, and witness statements created an increasingly detailed map of pre-existing conditions. Investigators were beginning to understand the interplay of isolation, obsession, and familial tension that may have contributed to the tragedy. Each piece reinforced the notion that the murders were not an isolated impulse. They were embedded within a network of secrets, resentments, and psychological stressors that had quietly intensified over time. And yet, even with these discoveries, one question remained unanswered. Which specific secrets held the key to understanding what truly motivated the acts of December 14th? The FBI had uncovered a trove of information, but within it lay contradictions, ambiguities, and clues that only further investigation could clarify. As they continued to sift through journals, digital devices, and correspondence, it became increasingly clear that the full story had yet to emerge. But the most shocking revelations were still ahead. Hidden within the layers of family secrecy, digital evidence, and obsessive behaviors, investigators would soon discover a detail that reframed the entire case, something that made it impossible to view the tragedy as anything but deliberate, calculated, and horrifyingly intimate. Why would someone allegedly murder their own parents? This question hovered over the Reiner case from the very beginning, haunting investigators, family members, and the public alike. While the evidence in Nick Reiner's bedroom suggested premeditation, the motive itself remained elusive, layered, complex, and deeply unsettling. Unraveling it would require connecting behavioral patterns, family dynamics, and seemingly small details that, when combined, painted a disturbing picture of intent. Investigators began with what is often the most obvious motive: financial gain. The Reiner estate was substantial, valued at $13.5 million, not including additional assets or investments. Financial disputes, access to funds, and inheritance considerations were all scrutinized. Records of bank accounts, trust funds, and financial transactions were examined meticulously. On the surface, however, financial gain alone did not fully explain the violence. Nick's access to family resources, while restricted in certain areas, did not provide a clear incentive that aligned with the brutality of the crime. The question remained: could there be a deeper psychological component driving the act? The FBI expanded the focus to emotional and relational factors. Interviews with friends and extended family revealed patterns of tension and unresolved conflicts. Some suggested that Nick had struggled with feelings of inadequacy, frustration, or resentment toward his parents. Behavioral analysts noted that these emotional stressors, combined with obsessive tendencies, could contribute to an escalating cycle of fixation, preoccupation, and potential violence. This framework did not excuse action, it contextualized it. The investigators understood that motive is rarely singular. In complex cases, it's often the result of intersecting pressures. Digital evidence provided additional insight. Emails, text messages, and social media activity suggested a preoccupation with perceived slights and disagreements. Some messages were vague, others were more pointed, hinting at growing frustration, control issues, or even anger toward family members. Investigators interpreted these digital traces alongside the physical evidence from the bedroom, noting the way behaviors, thoughts, and obsessions intersected. Patterns emerged. A focus on timing, routines, and opportunity that suggested not just reactive anger, but planning informed by perception of familial control. Behavioral analysis played a critical role in deciphering the motive. Experts considered the combination of isolation, obsessive monitoring, and perceived restriction within family dynamics. Psychological profiles indicated that individuals in similar circumstances may develop fixation on perceived injustices, escalating over time. The act of violence, therefore, could stem from both emotional and psychological pressures, a sense of being trapped, frustrated, and controlled, coupled with an inability to cope through normal channels of communication or intervention. Investigators also explored less tangible motives: attention, recognition, and validation. In families under public scrutiny, the pressure to perform, comply, and maintain appearances can exacerbate underlying tensions. Was there a desire to assert control, to dominate, or to claim independence in the most extreme way? The FBI considered these psychological pressures alongside tangible evidence, recognizing that motive often emerges at the intersection of external expectation and internal compulsion. Yet despite these analyses, contradictions remained. Some behavioral indicators suggested impulsivity, while others pointed to deliberation. Notes found in the bedroom suggested careful observation, planning, and attention to timing, elements consistent with premeditation. However, certain patterns, such as emotional journaling or fragmented thoughts, indicated reactive impulses. Investigators had to reconcile these contradictions to understand the true driving force behind the murders. The timeline of events on December 14th also offered potential clues to motive. Investigators reconstructed the sequence of movements, interactions, and communications leading up to the murders. Small discrepancies in logs, minor inconsistencies in witness statements, and digital activity provided insight into mindset. Each piece suggested that the act was not spontaneous, but aligned with a series of deliberate decisions. These observations reinforced the notion that motive was more than emotional flair. It was intertwined with planning and psychological fixation. Some witnesses reported that Nick had previously expressed frustration over family rules, schedules, or expectations. While these grievances may seem minor in isolation, when combined with obsessive attention to daily routines and pre-existing tensions, they suggested a buildup of emotional pressure. Behavioral scientists emphasized that the escalation of perceived grievances, coupled with premeditation observed in the bedroom, could create a psychological environment in which extreme actions became conceivable. Investigators also examined potential triggers. Were there recent arguments, disruptions, or events that could have acted as catalysts? Analysis of messages, digital searches, and physical interactions suggested heightened emotional states in the days leading up to the murders. Certain notes indicated concern with control, autonomy, and oversight, core themes that connected both motive and premeditation. These insights began to form a narrative. The act was not purely reactive, but driven by a confluence of long-standing grievances, perceived limitations, and psychological pressures. Even as patterns emerged, investigators knew that motive could not be simplified. It was multifaceted, combining financial considerations, familial tensions, emotional preoccupations, and psychological fixation. The Reiner case demonstrated how complex family dynamics, when combined with personal isolation and obsessive behaviors, can create conditions for catastrophic outcomes. This complexity required investigators to maintain focus on both tangible evidence and the invisible, psychological threads that guided behavior. The FBI also considered alternative motives: external influences, peer interactions, or outside manipulation. These avenues were explored and largely ruled out, leaving the focus squarely on family dynamics and Nick's personal state of mind. The convergence of opportunity, access, pre-existing tension, and observed behavior reinforced that motive was rooted in the household itself, not external forces. And yet, even with these analyses, a critical piece of the puzzle remained missing. Physical evidence, digital traces, and behavioral indicators hinted at motive, but what would confirm it definitively? Investigators knew that the answer might lie in a combination of forensic discovery, psychological profiling, and perhaps most importantly, in items within Nick Reiner's bedroom that had yet to be fully interpreted. The mystery of motive was not just about understanding why. It was about reconstructing a psychological trajectory, a chain of decisions, and a pattern of thought that led inexorably to violence. It required connecting the unseen dots, linking private obsessions, family tensions, and observed behavior into a coherent explanation that could withstand scrutiny. And as investigators delved deeper, it became increasingly clear that what they were about to uncover would not merely explain motive. It would shock the world, challenge assumptions about family, and force everyone to confront a truth far darker than anyone had anticipated. In the 21st century, a person's digital life often tells more than their spoken words ever could. In the Reiner case, investigators quickly realized that understanding Nick Reiner's online and digital activity would be as crucial as the physical evidence found in the mansion and guest house. Every device, every file, every message, even those deleted, was a potential window into his thoughts, obsessions, and possible planning. What the FBI uncovered in this digital landscape would both illuminate the crime and deepen its chilling complexity. The first devices seized were Nick's personal laptops, tablets, and smartphones. Forensic experts immediately began cataloging their contents, using advanced software to recover deleted files, reconstruct browsing histories, and analyze patterns of communication. The sheer volume of data was staggering, but hidden within were critical fragments, timestamps, message threads, encrypted notes, and deleted searches that hinted at preoccupation with his parents, routines, and vulnerabilities. One of the first discoveries shocked the investigators, a series of documents and notes that appeared to track the movements of the family inside the mansion. They weren't just random observations. They were meticulously organized, sometimes listing times, locations, and habits. For example, a note might indicate that Rob Reiner typically left his study at 8:30 a.m., or that Michelle preferred the sunlit breakfast room in the morning. At first glance, these details seemed mundane, but when combined with the timeline of December 14th, they suggested someone had been studying patterns, perhaps preparing for an event that required precise knowledge. Deleted emails and messaging threads added another layer of intrigue. Some conversations contained cryptic language, hints of frustration, and expressions of anger toward family members. Investigators were able to recover partially deleted messages that indicated planning rather than random impulse. While none explicitly mentioned violent intent, the context, paired with the physical evidence and behavioral patterns, was deeply suggestive. Each recovered thread became a puzzle piece, slowly revealing a larger picture. Social media activity was another critical focus. While Nick maintained a low public profile, investigators discovered posts, interactions, and private messages that reflected his inner state. Some messages conveyed feelings of isolation, disconnection, or perceived injustice. Others were seemingly innocent, but when cross-referenced with other evidence, they suggested an individual who was deeply preoccupied with control, observation, and monitoring of his household. Behavioral analysts noted that this combination, emotional fixation combined with deliberate observation, was a hallmark of a psychologically intense premeditation. Beyond the obvious devices, hidden digital evidence emerged in unexpected places. Password-protected folders, encrypted notes, and cloud storage accounts contained data that had been intentionally concealed. Investigators realized that Nick had gone to great lengths to control what others could see, a sign of deliberate planning and secrecy. Some files contained reflections on family dynamics, lists of grievances, and even speculative ideas that suggested contemplation of extreme actions. While these documents didn't provide direct proof of motive, They offered critical insight into mindset. Financial records, digital calendars, and online activity also painted a picture of meticulousness. Transactions were logged and reviewed, revealing potential patterns of planning or preoccupation. Digital search histories included topics on psychological behavior, crime, and manipulation. Subjects that, while not incriminating on their own, provided context when paired with behavioral indicators from the bedroom and witness accounts. Investigators were seeing a convergence of psychological, digital, and physical evidence that, together, formed a coherent narrative of premeditation. Perhaps the most unsettling discovery was the layering of evidence. Deleted notes suggested concealment. Journal entries in digital format reflected obsessive thought. And email threads indicated long-standing grievances. Each layer reinforced the idea that this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act. It was embedded in months, possibly years, of internal preoccupation, observation, and planning. The FBI began to see a trajectory, from isolation to obsession, from perceived slight to violent action, all mapped across Nick's digital and physical footprint. Investigators also cross-referenced digital activity with events on the day of the murders. Location data, timestamps, and logs from connected devices allowed them to reconstruct movement, interactions, and timing with unprecedented precision. This forensic mapping provided critical insight. Gaps, inconsistencies, and deliberate actions all became apparent, giving a clear picture of how the day unfolded, and importantly, how the act may have been executed with foresight and calculation. Behavioral analysis of the digital evidence revealed patterns consistent with psychological fixation. Notes, deleted files, and encrypted documents showed a focus on control, observation, and timing. Behavioral scientists interpreted this as a significant indicator. Nick's mind was not just preoccupied. It was actively engaged in planning and monitoring the environment, behaviors, and routines of those around him. These